A millionaire walked through LAX like he owned the place until a waitress ran straight into him and wrapped her arms around his chest before realizing he was a complete stranger. That one accidental hug didn't just embarrass her, it dragged her into his world, a world where people like her were judged, watched, and never meant to belong. Yet everything changed the moment he refused to let her walk away. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Let's begin. Madison Hale pushed through the crowd in Terminal 4, her heartbeat matching the frantic announcements echoing above her. She had just ripped off her cafe apron after clocking out and rushed straight here, praying she wouldn't miss her cousin, one of the few family members she still trusted. The terminal was overflowing with travelers dragging suitcases, families waving signs, people shouting into phones, a chaos she was too anxious to process. All she could think was, "Don't let him walk past without seeing me." She lifted onto her toes, scanning every face. Then she saw him or someone who looked exactly like him, tall, dark jacket, same stride, same height. He stepped out of the gate, pulling a black suitcase behind him. Madison didn't stop to double-check. Emotion drowned out logic. She sprinted toward him and threw her arms around his chest with a shaky, "Welcome home." For a moment, everything went silent. The airport noise faded. Her arms tightened out of pure relief, her breath catching because she finally felt someone familiar in a place full of strangers. But the chest she clung to was firmer than she remembered, and the scent was wrong, warm cedarwood, expensive, unfamiliar. She lifted her head. Her stomach dropped. The man wasn't her cousin. It was Alexander Reed, yes, the billionaire tech founder whose face had been plastered on Forbes and CNBC since she was in high school. His gray eyes stared directly into hers, sharp and unreadable. Behind him, his bodyguard, Colton Hayes, stepped forward like he expected a security threat. "Ma'am, step back," he warned. Madison stumbled away so fast she nearly tripped over a suitcase. "Oh my God, I thought you looked like I'm so sorry." Words crashed into each other as her cheeks burned hotter with every second. A few travelers stopped to stare. Someone whispered, "Did she just hug Alexander Reed?" Another raised a phone. Alexander didn't flinch. He simply watched her meltdown with an expression that was somewhere between shock and amusement. "Well," he said, voice low and steady, "that's a first. No one's ever greeted me like that at LAX." Mortified, Madison shook her head and practically ran, weaving through people until she couldn't see him anymore. She didn't stop until she reached the bus stop outside, where she finally let out a shaky breath. What a nightmare. As if her life wasn't already exhausting enough. Rent overdue. Evan's medical bills still unpaid. Extra shifts, not enough sleep. And now she had hugged a billionaire like some insane, lost puppy. She slid onto the bus seat and stared out the window, trying to pretend the whole thing hadn't happened. But humiliation sits heavy, and it followed her home like a shadow. Later that night, she turned on the TV just to drown out her thoughts. The evening news displayed exactly the last face she wanted to see. "Alexander Reed returns to Los Angeles after a major acquisition," the reporter announced. Madison froze. She grabbed the remote and covered her face with a groan. She had made a fool out of herself in front of one of the wealthiest, most untouchable men in the country, and she would never see him again, or so she thought. What she didn't know was that the ridiculous, accidental hug was only the beginning of everything that would unravel next. By the next evening, Madison convinced herself she had recovered from her humiliation. She tightened her ponytail, tied her cafe apron securely around her waist, and told herself she just needed to get through another long shift. Mr. Daniels, her manager, was already tense. "Stay sharp tonight, Madison. We're understaffed. No mistakes." She nodded, pushed open the swinging door, and stepped behind the counter, her little island of routine and survival. The bell above the entrance chimed. She looked up casually, then dropped an entire tray of water glasses. Alexander Reed stood in the doorway, not hiding behind sunglasses, not dressed incognito. He walked into the tiny airport cafe like it was the most normal choice for a man worth hundreds of millions. He scanned the room once, then of course chose the closest table to where she stood, directly in her line of sight. Madison's pulse shot up. She pretended to wipe the counter, though her hand shook. Maybe he didn't recognize her. Maybe billionaires meet thousands of people a week. Then he smirked. "I was wondering if I could get another welcome hug," he said. Her face heated instantly. I can get you coffee. That works too." She scribbled his order, trying not to lose every ounce of professionalism, but she felt his gaze following her every movement. Not in a creepy way, more like he was genuinely curious about her, and that terrified her more. When she served his coffee, he studied her in a way that made her want to run and stay at the same time. "Relax," he said softly. "I didn't come here to embarrass you." "Then why are you here?" she asked without looking at him. "I liked our first interaction." "That was not an interaction," she muttered. "That was a catastrophe." His smile widened. "A memorable one." Madison escaped to the back counter, but over the next few days, Alexander became a constant. He visited the cafe every evening, always sitting at the same table, always waiting until she was the one to take his order. Her co-workers whispered nonstop, "Why would a billionaire hang out here? Is he into her? Is she hiding something?" Mr. Daniels grew suspicious and borderline jealous, constantly watching her every move. Madison tried to create distance. She kept her answers short and polite. She never lingered. She never flirted. The last thing she needed was drama that could cost her job. Yet Alexander had a way of slipping past her defenses with simple observations. "Most people rush. You actually ask if someone wants extra sugar. It's refreshing. You notice that?" she asked cautiously. "I notice a lot of things." Madison hated how those words made her stomach flip. One evening, as she handed him his usual drink, Alexander leaned back and said, "Have dinner with me." She nearly choked. "What? No, absolutely not. It's just one dinner. I can't. You're Madison." He shrugged lightly. "I want to know the woman who hugged me without hesitation." Her pride bristled. "I'm not some challenge for you, Mr. Reed." "Good," he replied calmly. "Challenges bore me. You don't." His tone struck straight into her resolve. Against her better judgment, and maybe because his last remark stung something in her, she exhaled sharply and said, "Fine. One dinner. That's it." He didn't hide the small smile of triumph. Dinner surprised her. He didn't take her to some intimidating high-end restaurant. Instead, it was a quiet place tucked between two bookstores, warm lights, worn wooden tables, music just loud enough to feel human. Alexander talked about his childhood in a way she didn't expect, and he listened to her stories like they mattered, even the silly ones. By the time he walked her to the bus stop, he didn't touch her. He didn't ask for a second date. He just looked at her like she was the only thing standing between him and the rest of the lonely world he lived in. That night, Madison lay in bed replaying his final words. "I'll see you again." She laughed under her breath, convinced he was being polite. But the next morning, when she walked into the cafe, Alexander was already sitting at his table, waiting for her. Madison walked into the cafe the next morning with a knot already forming in her stomach. She had convinced herself that last night's dinner meant nothing, that Alexander Reed had simply been polite, curious, or bored. Anything but genuinely interested. But when she stepped behind the counter and looked toward the seating area, he was already there, sitting at the same table, elbows on the armrests, eyes fixed directly on her. No menu in hand, no phone, just watching her walk in like he had been waiting for that moment. Her steps faltered before she forced herself into motion. Maybe if she stayed busy, if she kept her head down, he would get tired and leave. She grabbed the order pad and nudged a coworker. "Can you take table 7? But before the coworker could answer, Mr. Daniels appeared behind her with that sharp, territorial tone he used whenever he felt his authority was slipping. "No switching tables. You take whoever sits in your section." Her coworker shrugged helplessly. Madison inhaled slowly, steadying her breath, then walked toward Alexander. He smiled as if her reluctance amused him. "I told you I'd see you again." She cleared her throat, trying to sound detached. "What can I get for you?" "You already know my order," he replied. And he was right, she did. Somehow, that made her more uneasy. The days that followed unfolded in a pattern she didn't expect. Every evening, at nearly the same exact minute, Alexander walked into the cafe. He chose the same table. He ordered the same drink. He didn't demand attention, didn't act entitled, didn't talk unless she approached him. And yet his presence changed everything. The other baristas whispered behind the espresso machine. Some were jealous, some excited, most confused. Even Cole, the bodyguard, had started giving Madison a brief, knowing nod whenever he accompanied Alexander. like he was quietly rooting for something to happen. Madison tried hard to keep a safe distance. She reminded herself that people like Alexander didn't live in worlds like hers. Men with fortunes didn't fall for women who scraped tips to pay medical bills. Whenever she felt the faintest pull toward him, she shut it down. Still, Alexander had a way of slipping past her guard without trying. When she handed him his drink one evening, he studied her face and said, "You look tired, too tired for someone who carries everyone else's day so gracefully." Her breath caught for a second. "You drink too much coffee," she muttered. "It can't be good for you." He rested his elbow on the table, eyes warm. "I only drink this much when I'm hoping to run into someone." Her heart skipped, and she quickly looked away. That night, her shift was nearly over when her phone flashed with a hospital number. Madison stepped aside to answer, and her whole world tilted when she heard Evan had been admitted in severe pain. She rushed to Mr. Daniels, asking for permission to leave early. But he didn't even look up from his clipboard. "No, we're slammed tonight. You finish your shift." Madison felt her throat tighten. "My brother is in the hospital. I need to go." "After your shift," he said coldly. Alexander was already standing. She hadn't noticed him watching from the table until he approached the counter with quiet authority. "How much is your register total right now?" he asked. "Mr." Daniels stared at him, confused. "What?" "I'm buying the rest of her shift," Alexander said calmly. "Whatever she would make, whatever the cafe needs to stay balanced, I'll cover it all." Mr. Daniels blinked like he didn't know whether to argue or bow. In the end, he stepped back. "Fine, she can go." Madison looked between them, overwhelmed by panic, gratitude, anger, and confusion all at once. She managed to whisper, "Thank you," before running out of the cafe and disappearing into the stream of travelers. Alexander watched her go, his expression tightening in a way that surprised even him. He was used to fixing problems instantly, but here he was, feeling powerless for the first time in years. Cole touched his shoulder lightly. "She'll be okay," he said. But Alexander wasn't convinced. That night, Madison sat alone in a stiff hospital chair, staring at the light above the emergency room door while fear clawed at her ribs. Her phone buzzed beside her. She almost ignored it until she saw the name. "If you need me, I'm here." She didn't answer, but her fingers hovered over the screen longer than she meant them to, because deep down she already knew. She did need him, more than she wanted to admit. By morning, Madison felt like she had aged 10 years overnight. She had barely slept, her eyes were swollen, and her nerves were raw. She pushed open the hospital door and stepped into Evan's room. He was asleep, his face pale under the thin blanket. The doctor had told her earlier that they needed more tests, that the situation wasn't simple. She sat beside her brother, feeling the weight of helplessness settle heavier than ever. When she stepped out to get some water, she nearly dropped the cup in her hand. Alexander was standing in the hallway, holding a paper bag and 2 coffees. He wasn't dressed like a billionaire today, just jeans, a simple sweater, and worry in his eyes. "You didn't have to come," Madison said softly. "I know," he answered, offering her a cup. "But I wanted to." Madison closed her eyes for a second, trying to stay strong. But the moment the doctor mentioned the estimated cost for Evan's tests and treatment, something inside her cracked, her knees weakened, her vision blurred, and she felt tears spill before she could stop them. She hated breaking down, especially in front of someone like Alexander. She wiped her face quickly. "I'm fine," she lied. Alexander stepped closer, his voice low. "You don't have to be." She shook her head, stepping back from his hand on her shoulder. "I don't want pity." He held her gaze, unwavering. "I'm not pitying you. I care. That's different." His voice was so steady, so sincere, that Madison felt something shift inside her. She sat down beside him on the small bench by the wall, too exhausted to pretend anymore. Words tumbled out about her parents, about raising Evan alone, about quitting school to work multiple jobs, about barely making rent, about every burden she'd carried quietly for years. Alexander didn't interrupt. He didn't offer solutions. He just listened, truly listened, like nothing she said made him see her as smaller or weaker. When she finally caught her breath, he spoke gently. "Let me help with the medical bills." She stiffened instantly. "No, absolutely not. Madison, I'm not relying on a man to survive," she snapped. sharper than she intended. But Alexander didn't flinch. "If I'm the only one who can help, does your pride matter more than Evan's health?" His question sliced through her defenses, but she still shook her head. He thought for a moment, then said, "Fine, then let me hire you." She blinked. "Hire me for what?" "My penthouse needs meals for a week. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. I want you to cook." Madison stared at him. "I'm a waitress, not a chef." "You cook at home," he replied. "Enough to care for the person you love most. That's all I need." She swallowed hard. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you deserve support, and because I want to help in a way you can accept without feeling indebted." His tone held no arrogance, no hidden motives, just quiet sincerity. Madison looked through the window into Evan's room, the reality of the situation closing in around her. She had no savings, no backup plan, no time to hesitate. She whispered, "1 week." Alexander nodded, a soft relief flickering across his face. 1 week is enough. That evening, he drove her to his penthouse so she could see the kitchen. When the doors opened, Madison froze. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the entire LA skyline glowing under the night sky. Everything, every counter, every appliance, looked like it belonged on a magazine cover, not in a real home. She felt painfully out of place, standing in that polished world of glass and marble. "This isn't my world," she murmured. Alexander stepped beside her, his voice gentle. "You might be surprised." Madison stood there, staring at the reflection of the city lights in the glass, realizing she was crossing into something she didn't fully understand. She didn't know if it was an opportunity or a disaster waiting to happen, only that her life would never return to what it had been before. And she was right. Madison stepped into Alexander's penthouse on Monday morning with her tote bag clutched close to her side, trying not to gape at the panoramic view swallowing the entire horizon. Los Angeles stretched beneath her like a glittering map, skyscrapers catching the sun, freeways looping like tangled silver ribbons. She felt like she had walked into a movie set rather than a home. Everything felt too polished, too expensive, too still, like one wrong move would shatter the illusion and expose her for the outsider she was. She forced herself to stand straighter, reminding her lungs how to breathe. "So, where should I start?" she asked, attempting a tone that made this feel like any other job. Alexander watched her with a quiet ease that unsettled her more than the view. "Wherever you're comfortable," he said, as if comfort was something she could possibly find up here. Cole stood near the hallway, respectful but observant, offering Madison a polite nod before retreating far enough to give them space. The kitchen was almost intimidating in its perfection: sleek marble counters, touch-screen appliances, knives arranged in flawless symmetry. Madison opened cabinet after cabinet, trying to memorize where everything was, only to realize every tool she needed was duplicated twice in some ultra-luxury version she didn't know how to operate. When she accidentally dropped a ladle, it clattered loudly on the floor. She bent down to grab it just as Alexander did, and their hands touched for a moment too long. She jerked back, pulse quickening. He didn't apologize or tease her. He simply held her gaze, that unreadable calm that made her even more nervous. The first meal she cooked was simple eggs, toast, and a modest salad, nothing worthy of a penthouse breakfast. But Alexander sat at the kitchen island and ate every bite without complaint. "It's good," he said, and the way he said it made her wonder if he meant the food or the moment. Over the next few days, their conversations slowly shifted from polite exchanges to real ones. Madison shared small pieces of herself: the art classes she once dreamed of taking, the scholarship she turned down after her parents died, the nights working double shifts to keep Evan fed. Alexander surprised her by sharing too. He talked about growing up, gifted but lonely, about the pressure of running a company before he was 30, about the constant fear of disappointing investors who saw him as a machine rather than a man. Their differences were undeniable. He lived above the clouds. She lived paycheck to paycheck, but the more they spoke, the more strange it felt that their worlds had never touched before. Still, Madison kept her boundaries sharp. One evening, as she placed dinner on the table, she said bluntly, "I'm only here for work, nothing else." He studied her for a moment. "Do you think I'm trying to buy anything more?" She opened her mouth to reply but didn't know how. There wasn't an answer that didn't reveal how flustered she felt around him. Late in the week, Alexander received an invitation to a charity gala. Normally he attended with a business partner or a publicist-approved companion, but that afternoon, As Madison washed dishes, he leaned against the counter and said, almost casually, "Come with me tonight." She froze, soap dripping from her hands. "Why? I don't belong there." "I don't need you to belong," he said. "I just want you there." She spent nearly an hour staring at her reflection in the penthouse bathroom mirror, wrestling with every insecurity she had ever carried. She was a waitress with circles under her eyes, someone who lived in a cramped apartment with peeling paint. Next to Alexander, she felt like a scribbled margin note standing beside a printed headline. But then she thought of Evan, of why she was here in the first place, and willed herself to breathe. It was just one night. When she stepped into the living room wearing a simple navy dress she had owned for years, Alexander stopped mid-sentence, his expression softening in a way that made her stomach twist. "You look—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. They walked to the car together, and as the driver pulled into the gala entrance, camera flashes erupted instantly. Madison blinked against the lights, stunned. Alexander placed a steadying hand at the small of her back, not claim, not possession, just reassurance. Inside, Madison felt the weight of every gaze. Hollywood faces she'd only seen on screens stared at her like she had arrived from another world. Her nerves prickled, warm and sharp. She tried to breathe through it, but the air felt thinner than at the penthouse windows. Then she heard a silky, too familiar voice behind them. "Alexander?" He turned, and Madison followed his gaze to a woman whose beauty was almost unreal, Victoria Monroe. Her eyes drifted over Madison with a look that sliced rather than assessed. In that instant, Madison understood that stepping into Alexander's world wasn't just crossing a line, it was stepping into a battlefield. Victoria Monroe approached with the smooth confidence of someone used to owning every room she walked into. Her hand slid warmly onto Alexander's arm as if it belonged there. Madison felt her stomach twist, not with jealousy but with the sharp reminder that she was out of her depth. Victoria's smile was poised and perfect as she extended a hand. "Madison, right? You work at the airport cafe. Must be interesting, serving people all day." Madison returned the handshake, though her palm felt impossibly damp. The comment carried no vulgar insult, but it was wrapped in a velvet coating meant to sting. Victoria's eyes flicked briefly toward Madison's dress, then back to her face, amusement dancing in her expression. Before Madison could respond, Alexander shifted his stance slightly, placing himself between them. "She's my guest tonight," he said in a tone that left no room for interpretation. Victoria's smile didn't falter, but the edge in her eyes sharpened. "How lovely," she replied. "I didn't realize your tastes had changed so much." Alexander didn't bother entertaining her bait. He moved Madison gently toward the interior of the ballroom, guiding her away from the clusters of curious onlookers who had started whispering. Inside, cameras continued flashing, catching every movement between them. Madison tried her best to breathe steadily, but the attention pressed on her like heat. She could practically feel the judgment hovering in the air, people wondering who she was, why she was there, what she wanted. She held her clutch so tightly her knuckles turned white. Alexander leaned toward her, lowering his voice. "You're tense." "I'm fine," she lied. He glanced down at her hand, gripping her purse. "Your fingers disagree." She exhaled sharply, trying to ground herself. She didn't want him to see how rattled she was. She didn't want to appear fragile, but she couldn't ignore the ache of being so visibly out of place. Moments later, Victoria returned, unable to let the moment go. "I was just telling some friends how particular you used to be, Alexander," she said with a sugary tone. "You hated when women got close to you for the wrong reasons." The implication was obvious. Madison felt her chest tighten. She didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. She excused herself and headed toward the terrace, desperate for air. The cool breeze washed over her skin like relief, but the humiliation lingered. A minute later, Alexander stepped outside, hands tucked in his pockets. "Talk to me," he said gently. "There's nothing to talk about." "Madison," his voice softened. "You don't have to pretend." She looked out at the city lights far below. "I don't fit here. I never will." "You fit wherever you choose to stand," he said quietly. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." His words struck something deep inside her, not romantic, not dramatic, just painfully sincere. The rest of the night passed in quieter tones. Alexander kept a respectful distance, but he never let her drift too far from him, always making sure she felt anchored. When the gala finally ended and they rode home in the car, The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was charged, contemplative, threaded with the unspoken truths neither of them dared to name. But by morning, everything changed. When Madison turned on her phone, her notifications were flooded texts from coworkers, missed calls, links from friends. The headlines were everywhere. Billionaire Alexander Reed spotted with mystery waitress. Airport worker attends gala with tech mogul. Who is the woman on Alexander Reed's arm? Madison's chest tightened as she scrolled, her reflection dimming in the screen's glow. The storm had arrived, and it was coming for her first. Madison woke to the sound of non-stop buzzing on her nightstand, the vibration rattling like an alarm she never set. When she finally grabbed her phone, the screen lit up with dozens of notifications, texts, tags, news alerts, and right there, splashed across every headline, was the image she dreaded most. Her standing beside Alexander on the red carpet, flashlights exploding around them like lightning. One headline read, "Billionaire Alexander Reed spotted with airport waitress." Another said, "Mystery woman on Alexander's arm, romance or scandal." Madison felt her breath leave her chest. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't even agreed to stand next to him in public. Yet here she was, pushed onto a stage she never auditioned for. At the cafe, the atmosphere tightened the moment she stepped inside. Customers whispered, pretending not to stare. A woman at the counter lifted her phone slightly, angling the camera as if to capture Madison's face. Her coworkers swarmed her before she could reach the sink. "Are you dating him? Is it serious? Did he really take you to that gala?" Madison forced a stiff smile and shook her head, but her voice cracked too much to sound convincing. Mr. Daniels didn't bother with subtlety. "Whatever drama you've gotten yourself into, don't bring it here," he said, arms crossed as though she had intentionally caused a PR crisis for his small cafe. "This is a workplace, not a tabloid center." Shame rushed up her throat like heat. She wanted to disappear, to crawl back into the quiet anonymity she had once resented. When Alexander walked in that afternoon, Madison's instinct was to retreat. She ducked into the back room, hoping he'd get the hint. But he waited 10 minutes, 15, until she finally emerged. His expression softened when he saw her red eyes. "Are you avoiding me?" She swallowed hard. "I'm avoiding this." She gestured vaguely toward the headlines glowing from someone's laptop. "I can't handle everyone staring at me, judging me, acting like I'm some joke." He stepped closer. "The media doesn't get to define who we are." She laughed bitterly. "You don't understand. You grew up in these storms. I grew up cleaning up after them." Alexander's gaze shifted, hurt, frustration, something deeper, but he didn't push her. Later that evening, another blow landed. A video from the gala surfaced, replayed endlessly online. In it, Victoria Monroe wrapped an all-too-familiar arm around Alexander, leaning in just enough to spark speculation. Comments exploded. "He belongs with her. He's out of her league. She's a gold digger." Madison watched the words until they blurred, each one slicing deeper. By closing time, she didn't want to hear his voice, didn't want to see him, didn't want to feel anything except numb. When she stepped out into the dimly lit parking lot, Alexander was already there, leaning against his car as if keeping guard. "Madison," he said slowly, "we need to talk." She shook her head, tears finally rising. "I want out. I want out of all of this, out of whatever this is between us." For the first time since she met him, Alexander had no reply. He looked like someone had taken the ground out from under him. On her way home, Madison passed 2 former workers from the old Hale family restaurant. She overheard the words, "By accident, Reed Global, bought the land," forced the closure phrases that froze her in place. She turned toward them, her pulse racing. "What did you just say?" One shrugged. "Reed Global bought out the block years ago. That's why the Hale place shut down." The realization slammed into her. The timing, the guilt, the sudden interest in her. Victoria's words, her own fears. Unable to breathe, unable to think, Madison stormed straight to the penthouse. Alexander opened the door, eyes softening with relief, until he saw her expression. "Did you know," she said quietly, "that your company bought the land that destroyed my family's restaurant?" Alexander inhaled sharply. "It was years before I took over. I never managed those acquisitions." "Would it matter?" She cut him off. "If none of that happened, would you even look at someone like me? Or am I just another thing you feel responsible for fixing?" Her voice cracked, hurt and humiliation tangled with anger. Alexander reached for her, but she stepped back, the distance suddenly infinite. "Madison," he started. "Don't," she whispered. "Just don't." She left without waiting for his answer. Alexander didn't follow. He stood in the dark penthouse, the city lights glowing behind him, watching the door close. For the first time, he let her walk away. The week that followed felt like a return to a life Madison no longer fit into. She went to work. She punched her time card. She checked on Evan. She cooked simple meals in their small apartment, but every routine felt hollow, like the volume had been turned down on the world. Each time she passed the cafe window, she expected to see Alexander sitting in his usual spot, waiting with that calm patience she once found annoying. But the chair remained empty. No texts, no calls, no explanations. Just silence, echoing louder each day. She told herself it was good, that this was what she wanted, that life was simpler without him. But when she lay awake at night, she missed his quiet jokes, his steady presence, the way he listened without judgment. She missed the brief moments she allowed herself to feel seen. Meanwhile, Evan's treatments intensified. Madison picked up every shift she could, clinging to the belief that she had made the right choice for him, if not for herself. She refused to let her emotions dictate her priorities. She had survived before Alexander. She would survive after him, but her heart didn't entirely believe that. One evening, after a brutally long shift, Madison locked up the cafe and turned toward the exit. That's when she saw him. Alexander stood near the doorway, his posture uncharacteristically tense. He looked tired, worn, almost, and it hit her that the silence hadn't been easy for him either. He walked toward her with hesitation she'd never seen. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi," she whispered back, unable to look directly at him. He reached into his coat and placed a plain white envelope on the counter behind her. "I owe you the truth, and an apology, but I won't force you to hear either." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. She swallowed. "Why did you disappear?" Alexander took a breath. "Because every time I tried to fix things, I made it worse. I didn't want to become the reason you questioned your worth. I didn't want you to think I was trying to erase your pain with money." His honesty momentarily unbalanced her. She didn't know what to say, and he didn't wait for her search for words. He nodded once, turned, and walked out the door. Cole gave Madison a respectful look before following him into the night. The emptiness that fell over the cafe was sharp and immediate. Madison stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. Her breath caught when she unfolded the document inside. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a check. It was a property deed, her family's old restaurant location now legally transferred into her name. No note, no flourish, just a single line scribbled at the bottom. "What belonged to you should never have been taken from you." Tears blurred the page. She grabbed her coat and ran through the terminal, out to the curb, into the first cab she could find. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She simply moved toward the one person she couldn't ignore any longer. When Alexander opened the penthouse door, he looked startled to see her. She didn't let him speak. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding him with a fierceness she didn't understand until that moment. His breath caught, his hands hovering for a second before he finally pulled her close, as if afraid she might vanish if he held her too tightly. "I was wrong," she whispered into his chest. "I thought you were trying to fix me, but you were just giving me back something I lost." Alexander exhaled shakily. "Madison, I reached out to you because of you, not because of your past." This time, he didn't have to ask for a hug. She gave it freely, fully, without fear. But the moment she stepped into the hallway to leave, her phone rang. A nurse from the hospital spoke in a rush. "Miss Hale, we need you to come immediately. Evan's condition has worsened. He needs emergency surgery, and we need a family signature." Madison's fingers trembled, and for the first time, she didn't question the instinct that followed. The first person she thought to call, the only person she knew would come, was Alexander Reed. Madison burst out of the penthouse lobby as if the ground had caught fire beneath her feet. The doctor's voice still rang in her ears, urgent, clipped, terrifying. "His condition is deteriorating. We need consent for immediate surgery." She fumbled with her keys, her breath sharp and uneven. Her fingers shook so violently she couldn't even get the car door open. She pressed her forehead to the cool metal, trying not to break. And then one name slipped out before she could stop herself. "Alexander." She dialed him with trembling hands. When he answered, she didn't even manage a full sentence. "Evan, surgery. I can't." The words strangled under the weight of panic, but Alexander didn't ask for details. His voice came quick and firm. "Tell me where you are. I'm coming right now." It wasn't just reassurance. It was a promise wrapped in certainty, and the moment she heard it, her chest loosened enough for her to breathe again. By the time she reached the hospital, Alexander was already there. His shirt was buttoned wrong from rushing, his hair disheveled, his breaths uneven. He wasn't the polished CEO the world expected. He was just a man who had run without hesitation. He approached the doctors with deadly focus, demanding clarity, signing papers with decisive strokes, covering every cost without a second thought. Cole stood near the doorway, subtly blocking reporters who had begun to gather, ensuring the corridor stayed private. Madison watched all of this from the corner of the room, her world collapsing and rebuilding all at once. When the nurses wheeled Evan into surgery, she felt her knees buckle. Alexander caught her arm gently, guiding her toward the waiting area. He didn't tell her to calm down. He didn't insist everything would be okay. He just sat beside her, lacing his fingers through hers, grounding her in a way nothing else could. She leaned into him slowly, like someone learning a new language. For the first time, there was no wall, no fear, no pride between them. "I'm so scared," she whispered. "Evan is all I have." Alexander turned slightly, letting her rest against his shoulder. "And right now," he murmured, "you're all I care about." Hours dragged on like entire lifetimes. Nurses passed, overhead speakers chimed, and shadows shifted across the linoleum floor. Madison spoke in quiet fragments about raising Evan, the nights she stayed up with homework she barely understood, the way she feared failing him every single day. Alexander listened with an intensity she had never seen, as if memorizing every piece she gave him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the surgeon emerged. Madison shot to her feet. "He made it through," the doctor said with a relieved smile. "The procedure went well. He just needs monitoring." Madison's tears came instantly raw, unstoppable. Alexander pulled her into his chest without hesitation, holding her as she shook with relief. In that moment, everything else disappeared. The headlines, the fear, the misunderstandings. There was only the man who had shown up when the world fell apart. When she finally lifted her head, her cheeks still wet, Alexander brushed a thumb across her skin without thinking. She breathed his name like a confession. "Alex." He looked at her as if waiting for permission, but Madison didn't let him ask. She leaned in and kissed him soft at first, then deeper, with a certainty that surprised them both. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't desperation. It was something that had been building quietly between them for far too long. When they finally pulled apart, both shaken, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "Does this mean you're not running anymore?" he asked in a low voice. Madison let out a tiny, breathless laugh. "I think I've done enough running." Later, he stepped outside to grab a change of clothes for her. Paparazzi waiting near the entrance snapped photos of him holding her hand before he left. Madison watched from the waiting room window, knowing instantly what tomorrow's headlines would look like. But for the first time, the thought didn't scare her, because she knew she wouldn't be facing it alone. A week later, the hospital room felt almost warm. Evan was sitting up, spooning oatmeal into his mouth dramatically. "So," he said between bites, "you and Alex, are you, like, official or what?" Madison nearly dropped the spoon she was holding. "Evan," she hissed, but her brother just laughed, the sound brighter than it had been in months. She couldn't hide her smile because, yes, something had changed. Something real. Outside the hospital walls, the world had erupted. Headlines questioned everything. Influencers speculated. Victoria Monroe tried to stir the pot with vague posts, but Alexander had cut through all of it with a single press conference. Standing in front of reporters, he said clearly, "I'm not here to discuss gossip. I'm here to say I care about Madison Hale. That's all anyone needs to know." Madison watched the live stream from the hospital cafeteria, tears stinging her eyes as he shielded her from a world that had never been kind to people like her. Not long after Evan was discharged, Alexander drove Madison and her brother to the old Hale restaurant, the building that had once been their family's pride. It looked tired now, its windows dusty, its sign faded. Madison stepped inside, her steps slowing as memories spilled from every corner. She reached toward the wall where her father used to measure Evan's height with a pencil. Alexander brushed a hand against her back. "Let's rebuild it," he said simply. "Not my way. Yours." And so they began. Contractors came, designers sketched. Evan hovered with too many opinions. Madison spent afternoons testing recipes and nights sketching new menu ideas. Alexander showed up whenever he could, sometimes in tailored suits between meetings, sometimes in rolled-up sleeves ready to move boxes. He tried to help chop vegetables once, nearly losing a fingertip. Evan laughed so hard he cried. Madison laughed too, the sound echoing through the empty space like a promise. Days passed, and something subtle shifted inside Madison. She stood straighter. She spoke louder. She began to see a life beyond surviving. She no longer felt like a woman who lived in the corners of other people's stories. She was writing her own. The grand reopening of Hale's Kitchen arrived with bright skies and a line stretching down the block. Reporters stood respectfully behind velvet ropes, waiting to cover the story of a once-lost family business reborn. Evan hugged her tight before unlocking the doors. "You did this," he whispered. "You really did." Madison blinked hard, overwhelmed. Inside, Alexander moved through the crowd, carrying trays, laughing awkwardly when guests recognized him. "CEO turned waiter," one man joked. Alexander shot a glance toward Madison. "For her, I'll take the job." She felt her heart warm in a way she couldn't hide. When the crowd finally thinned and the night air cooled, Alexander took her hand and guided her to the quiet alley behind the restaurant. It was the same alley where she used to chase Evan when he was small, the same place she had cried when the restaurant closed. Now it felt different, reborn, like everything else. Alexander looked at her with a gentle seriousness. "You keep asking why I chose you," he said, "but you don't realize. You chose me first. The second you hugged me at the airport, before you even knew my name, you saw me as a person. Not a title, not a story. Just me." Tears gathered in her eyes, fragile and bright. Alexander dropped to one knee and opened a small velvet box. The ring inside wasn't enormous or flashy. It was simple, elegant, exactly her. "Madison Hale," he said quietly. "Will you choose me again? Not by mistake this time. On purpose." Madison's breath caught, but her answer didn't need thought. "Yes," she whispered, voice trembling. "And this time, when I hug you, it's absolutely on purpose." Evan burst around the corner, cheering as he wrapped his arms around them both. Behind them, the restaurant glowed warmly through its windows, a symbol of everything they had rebuilt, not just a business, but a life, a future, a home. Madison looked at Alexander through a blur of happy tears. It turned out that the moment she thought was her biggest mistake was actually the beginning of everything right. And some hearts, once they finally choose, never choose wrong again. Sometimes life breaks in the least expected places, right in the middle of an airport, hug gone wrong, a hospital hallway, or a long night when you think you've already run out of strength. But even then, something quiet can rise from the mess. A reminder that the things meant for us often find a way through, not because everything is easy, but because we refuse to give up on the pieces that matter. If this story reached you at a moment when you needed a little hope, I'd love to know where you're listening from right now. Your room at midnight, your living room on a rainy afternoon, or maybe during a walk after a long day. Share it in the comments. You never know who might feel less alone because of it. And if you'd like more stories that sit gently with you the way this one did, feel free to subscribe. I'd be grateful to have you stay for the next chapter.